if I had to pinpoint what is the thing about Sunday morning that most gets me, it's looking around the church at people whose lives I know and whose struggles I know and whose stories I know. Watching them worship is so powerful, because I can see, I'm like, I know where you've come from. I know where you were even like a few years ago. I sat with you and you were crying last week. Like, to have that sense so that the vertical and the horizontal dimension are all just like smushed up together in a way that they're only going to get more smushed up in the new creation, right? As we together are Jesus's bride. Seeing that beautiful expression of God with us in the faces of my brothers and sisters is perhaps my favorite thing about church.
Hello and welcome to Post-Christianity. My name is Glen Scrivener.
And I'm Andrew Wilson.
We are thinking about our post-Christian moment, how we got here and what we do about it. And we're thrilled to be joined by Rebecca McLaughlin, all the way from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thank you for joining us, Rebecca.
Hello, hello, hello.
Now, we've just filled you in a little bit on where the podcast has been. We have done a history of the world, stopping off quite a bit in 17...
That was episode 1.
History of the world, already covered.
Ridiculously uppity title.
We got to 17... We spent quite a bit of time in 1776. And so that's the focus of Andrew's book as the invention of the modern world, remaking our world. And we've thought a little bit about air we breathe type things, which is my book, and compassion and equality and consent and freedom and kindness and all those sorts of things, and how Christianized we already are. And we've sort of got a little working definition of post-Christianity. I like Andrew's kind of analogy of it's like post-industrial, because it's been forever shaped by industrialization. It doesn't necessarily mean we're all going up chimneys and working at mill, but we have been forever shaped by this thing and cannot wind the clock back and cannot be anything other than a kind of a branch on this tree that has happened. And so here we are in this post-Christian moment. You have lived a lot of your life in the US now, but grew up in the UK, and you're ministering in a context in which people are thinking very deeply about our culture and our cultural moment. So how do you navigate this question? We're really trying to bring it into land in the series. So what? Even if we get the pin in the map about where our culture is, what does that mean for the Church of Jesus Christ to live faithfully and fruitfully today?
I think it's really easy for people to hear even the term post-Christian. I know you guys have done a lot of interesting work in thinking about what that does and doesn't mean, and think that what that means is the church is in decline, on the back foot, woe is me, batten down the hatches at best, try and hold on to our kids, certainly not out there knocking on doors, gathering people in and calling them to repent and believe. I actually think that we are very much in a place where, as the Lord put it, the harvest is plentiful, and the workers are only somewhat few. So I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which, in case listeners are not familiar, is not the Bible Belt in America. You know, this in American terms is one of the most post-Christian, and the particular kind of Christian that the Northeast is post, at least in sort of more recent memory, is more kind of post-Catholic. I think there's quite a lot of sort of historically Catholic families here, you know, relative to other parts. My husband's from Oklahoma, which is proper Bible Belt, and where most people, if they're post-Christian, are kind of post-Baptist, I suppose, in flavour. And what I'm increasingly struck by is just the spiritual openness, actually, around me here. And the fact that some of the most basic Christian, the most basic things that Christians have always been called to do are in many ways the things that Christians are called to do now. Inviting people into our homes, inviting people to church, asking questions to understand what individuals believe and why, to get to know them, to have a real interest in their lives. And even just in the last week, I've had the opportunity to talk with people from a whole range of backgrounds. You know, a friend raised Jewish in California who is seriously considering the Christian faith, young woman raised with no Christian background who's been coming to our community group and very, very much on the edge of repenting and believing. A woman who randomly walked into our church building yesterday when I happened to be meeting with one of the pastors and another friend, who wanted to pick up some furniture that we'd left out for anyone to pick up, stuff we didn't need anymore. And on the way out, I said, "Oh, would you like us to help move the furniture?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "We're here every Sunday. Would you like to come?" And she said, "Yeah, actually, I've been thinking about coming to church, but I've driven past this church, but I've never kind of taken the step." Great, come on Sunday. I mean,
Yeah.
just even just in the last 24 hours, as I say, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, not the Bible Belt, so much opportunity for people who just need an invitation often, and an invitation, a relationship, an ongoing invitation that isn't only come to church on Sunday, but maybe also come to our Bible study, come and have dinner, come just like a kind of come and see welcome that gives people space to hear about Jesus. Sorry, I'm like going kind of
No, this is brilliant. I think you're absolutely right. I think that it's fascinating to think that for all the analysis that I think telling the story about how we got to where we are, I hope is very helpful. The reason I find it helpful is because I understand people better when I'm talking to them. But actually the fundamentals of what you do, praying for people, inviting people to church, having meals with people, asking good questions, taking opportunities to share, being bold when you need to, basically the same sorts of things that Christians have had to do in every generation. And I just think that's, I think instinctively should probably resonate with all Christians going, of course, the same things Jesus said. I love the way you framed it. It's like, well, I've come to believe that what the Lord said is true. I thought that was very good. And obviously those who don't agree are not with the Lord. I thought it was actually...
it's tricky because, of course, Jesus was talking at a particular time and in a particular place. So what he said then was absolutely and unquestionably true then. I just increasingly feel like it's actually true now. And... I've been thinking more and more about when disciples haven't caught any fish and Jesus says cast the net on the other side, and then there are so many fish that the boat is going to be overflowing. And I actually think if we Christians, or those of us who are Christians, don't know who's listening, if you're a Christian who's listening, if we actually jumped in as workers, I think our boats don't have the capacity for the number of fish. Like, I think actually that's our problem, not the fact that the fish have all swum away and there's absolutely no way we could ever reach them. I think it's actually, we got to sling our nets, and if one slings a net, I'm not really a fisher lady, so I don't know if one slings
Do you know
nets.
what, that's astounding, Rebecca, because when I think of you, I think of you out there in Nova Scotia, hauling
calloused fingers, just,
Could you talk about that then? So let's just go into that. When you say, I think it's the lack of capacity we may have for fish rather than the fish have all swum away. I really like that image. What do you mean by that? Talk a bit more about that.
I mean a number of things. Number one, and I just finished reading a book by our friend Mike Graham titled The Great De-Churching, which is looking at the phenomenon of millions of people, even just in the last 25 years in America in particular, who were going to church, now not going to church. And typically when we hear that kind of headline, we think, oh, that's because they've completely, they are so far from the Lord. They've just walked out of the door and nothing is going to bring them back.
Hashtag ex-evangelical.
Ex-evangelical. And actually, the book even has a category of ex-evangelicals. In actual fact, the majority of these people would come back next Sunday if somebody just invited them.
Yeah.
If somebody, if they had a positive connection with somebody who said, hey, come to church with me next Sunday, they would come. So we have millions of people who have walked out of the church for whatever reason. A lot of them kind of casually de-churched in the sense of they moved to a new place or something happened. They just didn't mean to stop going to church, but they did. And COVID is obviously a big disruptor of that. So there are all these people who used to go to church and don't, but actually not for any particularly good reason, really, who need to be welcomed in. And then there's all the people who've grown up one way or another without a Christian faith or without any meaningful understanding of who they are in the world, how they might relate to God, what this means for others, who are lonely, who are floundering. I don't want to make that sound sort of contemptuous, but who have been told the way to human happiness and flourishing is for you to figure out exactly who you are, looking, deep in yourself, find out your unique identity, and like actualizing that is what is going to lead to your happiness and fulfillment. Turns out it's a total disaster. And so there are all these people who are actually hungry for the Lord, who are seeking spiritual fulfillment through yoga or mindfulness, or like all the things that people reach for, which aren't bad in of themselves necessarily, but when they have that kind of spiritual dimension, they're trying to meet a need that people have, and we, under the Lord, we have the words of eternal life for these people, and the folks who I've had the privilege of connecting with, like, as I say, even in the last few days and weeks and months, one of the comments a couple of them made is like, I have never seen community like this. I've never seen just a group of people who come from all over the world. I mean, the place where I live in Cambridge is very sort of cosmopolitan, just because a lot of people move here for college and whatever. It's people from from China and from Iran and from Turkey and from Ghana and from Nigeria and from like all over the place, Korea, coming together around Jesus and eating together and laughing together and playing together and just like community. And this is incredibly attractive to people. This is what people are hungering for. I remember a few years ago talking with a friend who had been raised in an Orthodox Jewish home and then had sort of very much lost her faith in college and lived for many years, outside of any kind of faith tradition. And I was describing her, what do we do on a Tuesday evening, like our Bible study? And I was like, we get together, we share some snacks, we chat, we read the Bible together, and then we get into small groups and pray for each other. And she was like, oh, that sounds lovely. Not like no actual belief in God, whatever. And she was like, that sounds like a really lovely Tuesday evening, and a kind of wistfulness. I wish like I would like something like that in my life.
Right. Yeah. There's such hunger for that. Yeah.
Such hunger.
Yeah. We spoke in a previous episode about, are we in a post-truth moment? And Andrew, you made the point we're really in a post-trust moment. And it's not just that, church membership is declining. All membership of all societies, all corporate identity is absolutely shrinking, and those numbers are tanking across the board. But that leads to the kind of hunger that you're talking about, and a real opportunity for what does thick community look like, and where do you have community that is across boundaries, that is across distinctives of age, for instance, and of race and of class. The church has such an opportunity.
Well, and here's the thing. I think it's easy for us, if we are Christians and if we go to church regularly, to think that church on a Sunday should be comfortable and that it shouldn't be too much work. Like, we go there to be encouraged, to hear a sermon, to see our friends, to be, buoyed up by the experience. And none of that is bad in and of itself. I'm increasingly convinced that actually on a Sunday morning, those of us who are followers of Jesus need to be like working. But we need to be intentionally seeking out the people who don't have friends yet. Maybe because they don't fit in sociologically with most of the other people in the room. Maybe because they're new. Maybe because they're a single mother. Maybe because they're much older or much younger or whatever it is. And start conversations. And the reality is, it's much easier to talk to somebody if either you know them very well already or you have a very similar background. It's meaningfully hard work to talk to somebody who is from a very different place, either kind of geographically or just socially. And it can feel awkward. You're trying to think, well, what will be a good question to ask them? I don't relate to their life circumstances very well. It's hard work, right? And I think that's what we need to be doing on a Sunday, because otherwise what's happening, and this is where I think our boats aren't big enough, or they're not doing their job sufficiently. Every Sunday in our church, which is a lovely kind of little Southern Baptist church, funnily enough, in New England, people walk in for whatever reason, and it might be they were raised Catholic, haven't been to church in a decade, and then something happened in their life. They thought they just sort of tried church, but they didn't want to go back to a Catholic church. Or maybe, they drifted away from church some time ago. They thought they'd come back. Or maybe they're just, somebody from the neighborhood who just thought, you know what, I'm going to try walking into that church. They come in, they sit by themselves, they walk out. And we miss, week after week, we miss the opportunity to reach the people who have literally walked through our door, like our physical building. We miss them. And we may be thinking, I would love to pluck up the courage to reach out to a colleague or to pound the streets, calling people to Jesus. Those are both really good things, but we're actually missing even the people, like the fish who have literally swum into our building. We're letting them slip through the net. Sorry, I'm a little bit...
No, I'm just chuckling to myself about the use of the word literally in the sentence. The fish who have literally swum into our building. But that's extremely pedantic, and I'm very sorry, indefensible, because you make a really, really important point. But that's what it was. Yeah.
I was struck as well by the figures that Mike Graham shares about de-churching, really, and just how many millions of Americans, they may have left institutional religion, they may have left the church, but they've left all sorts of institutions, actually, and everyone is kind of retreating into themselves, and they just need
Unions,
to be invited.
Clubs,
Yeah. And that translates to the UK as well. So for our UK listeners, the Talking Jesus survey was in 2015 and again in 2022. And no matter how many times I tell Christians in this country, how open people are to invitations to the church and how open people are to Christians and how absolutely positive they are towards A, Jesus, and B, Christians, no Christian wants to believe it. Because everyone's like, they just needed to survey my friends. My friends think I'm an idiot. Well, why are you their friend? I don't know. What's wrong with you? but it's again and again, the Talking Jesus survey, and they've done this properly with a sample size of about 3,000 non-Christians, and asking them, even when they're asked, do you think Christians are, for instance, homophobic? And maybe 8% or less, when they're offered the chance to, here are a whole bunch of positive things, and they're busy ticking all the positive things about, the Christians that they know. And would you talk, would you say that Christians are bigoted? Not so much. Would you say they're homophobic? Not so much. They might be a little narrow. They might be a little superstitious or something. They'd have certain kind of phrases for Christians, but it's not the defeaters that we think Christians have, non-Christians have with us, and I just feel like we are disqualifying ourselves from outreach by thinking the world hates us or thinking the world is more distant from our message than it might well be, and that suits us because we're lazy. It suits us.
Well, I think it's partly that we're lazy and partly that we are fearful, and I understand that. It's funny, a few weeks ago, I gave a little talk on evangelism at my church, and it was not trying to say all that there is to be said about evangelism, but I always like to have 4 points that people are actually going to remember, and see if I can remember them. My first point is that evangelism is hard. Second point is that evangelism is hospitable. Third point is that evangelism is hopeful. That was actually the fourth point, so I've clearly forgotten what the third point is.
Heliocentric?
I'm going to guess it began with an H.
It did begin with an H. You're genius.
Really like
absolute genius.
I really want to know what it is, because that's a great message.
Heretical? Was it heretical?
It wasn't heretical.
No. Okay.
But one of the friends who'd come was non-Christian, who has been exploring Christianity with us, and she, whenever I see her, she sort of rehearses these points to me. It sort of kind of makes me laugh because her background's one where you would imagine that she would be one of the people who would make evangelism hard, and actually she's loves to be in these kinds of conversations. But I think we need to know that it's hard. It is vulnerable. Even inviting somebody to something and the possibility that they'll say no is that's taking a risk. Humble. Evangelism is humble. That's the one.
Nice.
Evangelism is hard. Evangelism is humble. Evangelism is hospitable, and evangelism is hopeful. We need to be ready for the hard. We need to be okay with being rejected, which is why we need brothers and sisters with us, because I'm puny. I'm all fragile and puny, and I'm not. I will struggle to put myself out there in bold evangelism if I don't have brothers and sisters to come home to.
Yes.
Or to go with.
But I think it's important to figure out the shape of what's hard about evangelism too. Because again, one way that we might disqualify ourselves from evangelism is by thinking it's hard intellectually and I don't have all the answers, and so it's best not to try, sort of thing. Or it's hard because most of my friends will just think I'm a bigot and a homophobe, and therefore it's not worth trying. So I'm fully on board with thinking, like, it's hard because it's vulnerable. Absolutely. It's hard to be hospitable. It's hard to open your life out to other people. It's hard to name the name of Jesus in a conversation. It can feel like a sort of sack of rocks just, landing on the dinner table. That's kind of right.
Andrew's just going to laugh at our analogies all.
No, I think it's a great analogy. I'm just going to laugh at your verbal typos, but I'm not going to laugh at the analogy. I think they're great.
So do you see what I mean? Like I think it absolutely is hard, and rejection is hard, and just being vulnerable and opening ourselves out and intentionally leaving space in our lives so that we can be open to people and open to relationships and that sort of thing, and inviting people to things, and they might reject us, they might not, having conversations with people and it gets awkward. But I just wonder whether we should press into like what in particular makes it hard, because I do feel like Christians can disqualify themselves from evangelism thinking it's the wrong kind of hard.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It is certainly the case. I mean, I not infrequently find myself in conversations where it is hard in that sense of pretty deep disagreement that requires, it's my day job to think about these things, so I tend to have, I'm probably more equipped than the average person just because I have the privilege of spending, all day long thinking about the objections to Christianity and how one might address them. But I understand why it feels intimidating to people. But I think this is where the hard and the humble can help each other, because the last thing we want to do if we're sharing the gospel is to come across as if we are sort of self-righteous and have it all together, because we're actually kind of undermining the gospel if that's what we're communicating. And it's sometimes what people are primed to hear us as saying. So I think it's okay to say when I don't know. I'm actually not. That's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I'd love to look into that more and get back to you. I think actually having the humility to say that at times is helpful, and as you point out, actually many people are much more positively disposed toward these conversations than we might think. They're eager for deeper conversations about meaning and truth and love and flourishing, and they're intrigued actually by people who seem to be orienting their lives around Jesus. It's intriguing.
Yeah, and I think the more we scatter seed more widely, it is true. The more I get surprised at how hard some people are to the gospel, but also more surprised by how open some people are to the gospel. So
That's well said.
We door knock the parish around our church 3 times a year, and it's less common for people to kind of slam the door in our face than it is for people to open up the door and say, come in for a cup of tea. I was actually praying last Sunday and I think you're an answer to my prayers. That happens a lot more than people slamming the door in our face. But you get so much, you get shocked by both ends, I think. But one of the things about that parable, Mark chapter 4, in scattering the seed, is the evangelistic wisdom of moving on. If the door doesn't open, there's something about my personality, because I spend all day thinking about objections to Christianity as well, that I want to batter down the door and say, here are all the reasons why you're wrong. Come on. But I'm not called to batter doors. I'm called to scatter seed. And like in the New Testament, moving on in those circumstances is huge. Shake the dust off your feet and don't cast pearl before swines. And like even in Acts chapter 17, I love that there's Paul in the Areopagus, and he's going toe to toe with the Epicureans and the Stoic philosophers, and some of them are sneering at him, and Paul just moves on. Like, there are a couple of named individuals who come to faith, and it sounds like, they might start the church, and so he just kind of hands it off, to those people, he moves on. And I just think, my temperament is I would want to stay there and wipe that sneer off their faces, because it is intellectually credible to believe in Jesus, and I want to have and he just moves on to Corinth, and he just scatters some more seed. And I just think that's a very healthy attitude to opposition, whatever opposition there is. You circle back to that friend, and if they had an adverse reaction to your invitation to carol services, that's all right. There'll be another carol service next year, and I can circle back to that person. But I don't have to batter down every door that's closed in my face.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a tension, because on the one hand, we do want to make sure that we are continuing to scatter the seed, and that we don't only kind of get caught up with the people who seem least interested, which I can certainly resonate with that. At the same time, I think there's something to persistence and to just continuing to show love and to be invitational with people who maybe even have been quite hostile toward us. I'm not talking about I'm not saying
you don't move on from loving them.
Yeah.
You never move on from loving them. Yeah, ever. Yeah.
Yeah, and just and certainly I've known people where it's really been years of Christians in their lives kind of putting up with actually their hostility before they've repented and believed in Jesus. So yeah, but it's funny that the parable of the sower, I used to be completely unmoved by it. To be honest, I was like, it's parable of sower, great. And then I was writing a Bible study last year, and I was looking at the parable of the sower, and I suddenly became deeply moved by it, because it was a reminder. It's not my job to figure out what kind of soil somebody else is. It's just not my job. My job is to be out there scattering, and the Lord is bringing this extraordinary harvest. Even though the majority of the ground that you're scattering on seems sort of unfruitful, that the Lord is then bringing this massive harvest that kind of outweighs the kind of barrenness or the weediness of the other soil. That the harvest that he brings from the good soil is just extraordinary. And so I suddenly became really moved by that parable in a new way.
Yeah, I remember I was preaching in a London church for 3 years before I went to train to become a vicar and do my theological training, and so I was 3 years in a church where 50% would not have claimed to be Christians. It was an incredibly evangelistic kind of church, and they were happy to keep coming back Sunday after Sunday. But they also seemed happy not to come to Christ. And my final sermon was on Psalm 32, and I was just pleading with people, come to the Lord, come to the Lord. I was in tears in the pulpit, and I was in pieces after the service. And a friend came up to me, and he gave me the most efficient pastoral care I've ever received. He completely changed my mood in 4 words. He just said, "You sowed the seed." And I was like, "You're right. For 3 years, I've sowed the seed. Okay, I can move on from this place, and the power is not in me. Seeds are incredibly powerful, but it's this slow, low, secret power that you hand over, and then it's not in your hands anymore.
Can I ask you about how have you found sort of sharing the gospel, evangelism in a post-Christian environment changing in the last 20 years? So we're all of the same age, I think. We were all at uni in the late 90s, and in the last 20 years, 25 years since we went to uni or whatever, how have you found evangelism changing in terms of the kinds of things you're talking about? What you found helpful, what you found that actually used to be quite a fruitful way to talk to people, and it isn't now. I never used to think that way. Now I do all the time. And perhaps anything about talking to young people as well, which I know you do. We all do, I guess. But yeah, so contextually, if the heart of what we're doing remains the same and is always the same in every generation, how has the expression of it changed in your life so far, and change according to the generation of the people to whom you're speaking?
Yeah, I think we have seen something of a shift from maybe more the intellectual credibility questions being on the front foot to more the moral questions being on the front foot. And it's not that those questions weren't there. So, you know, when I was an undergrad, like Christian sexual ethics was weird then and it's weird now. But I think it's even weirder now. And one of the things that I kind of like to say to people, actually, when we sort of get into a conversation, and I had one like literally yesterday with a woman in the neighborhood near our church who has never been a churchgoer, is sort of has a positive impression of our church from having been in the neighborhood for some time, but no kind of Christian background or whatever, and was just, you know, asking me some questions. And one of the things I like to say about like Christian sexual ethics is it's actually weirder than you think. You know, it's not just that as a Christian I believe that sex only belongs in marriage between a man and a woman, but that the whole point of this is a metaphor. It's all about pointing us to Jesus's love for his people, and so the even the most beautiful, wonderful, amazing relationship of that kind that we could have with another human being is only ever going to be a tiny echo of Jesus' love for us. Like that actually, I think often in those kinds of conversations where sexual ethics can feel like a kind of distraction from the gospel or a defeater to the gospel, I think it actually can be a gateway into talking about the gospel. If we can just sort of name from the first, this is wild, right? This is crazy, weird stuff. And I'm not pretending it's not. But actually, what I believe springs out of this understanding that actually Jesus stands at the center of reality, that Jesus is the one who fulfills our deepest desires and the longings of our hearts, and that he's left little clues and signposts to what that might mean in creation, in our lived experience and relationships, but that ultimately they'll only ever disappoint us if we put all the weight of our worship on that. They will only disappoint. So I think in terms of how things have changed, I think there is more of a front foot when it comes to sexual ethics, and obviously gender identity is an increasingly important and fraught conversation for Christians today, even more so than it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. A very kind of rapidly moving conversation there. I think especially in the US, conversations around race are still extremely important, and I think sadly a lot of Christians and a lot of churches have done a very poor job of representing well how the gospel speaks into those conversations. I think we've been far too quick to just sort of defend the record of our tribe, those of us who, like me, are both white and evangelical, rather than being willing to say, yes, actually there's a painful, horrible record of sin here, and I can acknowledge that. I can acknowledge that and grieve over that because I believe the Bible. Actually, my Christian faith motivates me to do that, rather than, oh well, that becomes a reason not to believe in Jesus. So I think, the ethical, the moral conversations.
I think it may be more acute in the US, but I think that's true across the West, isn't it?
Yeah.
You spoke earlier about there is hunger for Jesus. In fact, it was one of the first things you said. How is that expressing itself nowadays? Because in another age, I guess people who are ripe for hearing about Jesus might have felt an overwhelming sense of sin and guilt, and they need the relief of the gospel to come to them, and that is what the AntiChamber of the church looked like, and the AntiChamber of the gospel is people are kind of ripe for hearing of Jesus. It strikes me that that's not kind of the shape of what it looks like when people are hungry today. What does it look like when people are hungry for Jesus today?
I think it's a sense of loneliness and meaninglessness, and a sense that I've done all the things that culture told me to do, and it's left me miserable, depressed, confused, hurting. So I think then the AntiChamber is community. I think it's calling people in very tangible, physical, visceral ways, and saying welcome. And I think it's an opportunity for the church to function as the church, because you and I, we are utterly insufficient, not only because of our sinfulness, but also because of our limitedness to reach all the people around us. You know, if I walked out of my door right now, within a half-mile radius, there are far more people to reach than I can reach. And there are many people who I wouldn't even probably be the right person to reach them. But as a member of a local church and a Christian community, we have a whole team. And I think fielding that team to where we're all playing our different roles. You know, some of us, I'm somebody who's naturally happy to go and do the first contact. You know, come into church, I'll grab you, you're a newcomer, I'll start a conversation. I then really would love to connect you with somebody else who you might have been to the same university as, or who you might have come from the same state as, or who you might some kind of connection, and then to have that team be mobilized around people who might be interested in exploring Christianity, and there is a deep and delightful sense of joy and love and community that comes through working as a team together. And I think that's something that we Christians are actually starving for. I think we're robbing ourselves of the community that we could have because we are not out there working the mission that God has given us.
Yes. And therefore the realm of pastoral care and evangelism kind of comes together in really fruitful and helpful ways. Like if we're going to reach out in these sorts of ways, we're going to have to be, very pastorally sensitive, and we're going to have the kinds of communities that can really be places of healing and help for those who are lonely and those who are broken. And I'm always trying to say to people to give a vision that evangelism and pastoral care are the best of friends, that pastoral care is just evangelizing Christians and evangelism is just pastoring non-Christians. And one of the things that helps with is, just as you say, that all the church then becomes emboldened and equipped to be a part of this great evangelistic task, because I might not be a kind of a lippy person who is able to have all the words, but in 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter gives the shortest gift list in the New Testament, and he basically says, some people are really good with words, let them speak as though speaking the very words of God. Some people are serve, and let them serve with the strength that God requires. And I think those are umbrella terms for some people are good with words, some people are good with this deacon kind of hospitality, service. And what would it look like to get these two people, working together in the great priesthood of God, 1 Peter chapter 2? It would be evangelism the way it happened in the early church, evangelism the way it happened, in the book of Acts, evangelism the way it happened in those early centuries, which is opening up tables and homes and sprinkling it around with, there are some Rebecca McLaughlins in your church, and there are some Andrew Wilsons in your church, and let's get them around a table. But it doesn't just take those kinds of speaker-type gifted people. It really enfranchises, the entire body, because pastoral care and evangelism are integrated. Yeah,
and actually, I think we have been infected with the idea that it's so prevalent in the culture more generally, which is that I should be sitting around thinking about my own identity and my own, very much kind of caught up in my own self-fulfillment or lack thereof, my own sense of who I am, or failure to recognize who I am, and increasingly becomes a sense of inadequacy. I think the more I sit around by myself reflecting on my own self, the more boring and foolish and inadequate and unlovable I appear to be. It's only a downward spiral. It's not my job to sit around thinking those things. Actually, it's my job to be out there extending the love of Jesus and sharing the gospel and partnering with my brothers and sisters. And when I'm out there on mission, I am absolutely my best self. And so I think there's, not that this is the primary point of it, but there is a kind of, for want of a better word, a sort of therapeutic shape to mission that I think many of us as Christians, and actually I think even something as wonderful and beautiful as marriage and a nuclear family can feed this, where we've sort of retreated into ourselves or into our immediate kind of households, and we've lost that gospel-oriented outward focus, and we isolate ourselves and make ourselves sort of miserable in the process, when if we were out there, we don't have time for that. We're running toward eternity, and I don't have time to waste sitting around thinking how useless and inadequate I am. Do you know, like I just need to shut up and get on with it. I realize that may come across as like horribly insensitive to some, and so I want to walk that back a little bit, because I'm not saying that Christians can't and don't struggle with like real painful depression, anxiety, like these things that can grip us and that can crop up in the lives of the most faithful Christian who is serving with all of their heart. Like that's not what I'm saying at all. But I just know from my own experience, the more I'm focused on working under the Lord, being a worker in his harvest field, and the less I'm focused on Rebecca McLaughlin, actually the better. the happier and healthier I am, and the more I'm receiving Jesus's love in relationship with other people, rather than sort of turning in on myself. So I think finding ways to encourage each other in that, to draw each other out, to see each other's gifts and capabilities not as an end in themselves, but as a kind of mobilization of the team, spurring each other on, drawing each other out, shoulder to shoulder together, locking arms as we engage in the work that God's given us to do.
Yeah. What about the vertical dimension? Because we're thinking a lot about the outgoing, reaching out kind of posture, and I absolutely agree that atomized me by myself is not a healthy place to be, and we're meant to be outwardly curved, in that sense, rather than sort of inwardly curved. But there's another sense, and you mentioned it there as well, that together in church, we receive, we receive from God. And what about worship as well? And I'm turning to our charismatic friend here. Because Sunday is not simply, us reaching out. We're reaching up and we're receiving with open hands from a God who is strange, a God who is other. We spoke in previous episodes about that. There are times where it feels thin between heaven and earth, and there's a hunger for that as well, isn't there? What about weirdness and worship? Tell me about weirdness and worship.
This is the keep Christianity weird thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think the temptation can be, the world think this is very strange, so let's close the gap between us and the world, even if it means increasing the gap between earth and heaven, or at least feeling like you are. Clearly you don't, you never actually do, but you feel like you are. And I think you need to do the opposite, don't you? You need to say, actually, the gap, the strangeness of the church in the sense of our union with Christ, and our worship, our exuberance, our joy and suffering, the sacraments are just bizarre. Obviously, in my kind of culture, spiritual gifts are just bizarre. But the whole singing, people just the person who came to our church and just went, we asked for feedback, and he didn't actually pick up at any of the strange things. He went, I just don't have to do a hell of a lot of singing. And it was like the idea that outside of a football match, you would spend so much time singing for joy, almost no matter what was going on in your life, was a very alien idea. Yeah. And that weirdness is itself. I totally agree with what Rebecca said earlier, that people are often much more struck by the power of it than they are alienated by the strangeness of it. It seems to. I know it's not the same, but as you make the gaps, you almost see the connection between earth and heaven, which you express in all different traditions. Actually, have different strengths there. That it is very much a strength in the sacramental liturgical side, and others it's a strength in the sort of exuberance and spiritual liveliness side, and obviously ideally we'd be both, but actually as people see that, they're like, there is something about this that is quite. The number of people we've found who are not believers who come to our church and then they just don't even know why, they just find themselves crying through the worship as they're seeing. It's very rarely people go, that point you made. I mean, I preach all the time, so I want people to listen and people to engage. And often people are interested by it, but the bit that usually moves people isn't the preaching, in my experience, or at least the bit that usually moves the unbeliever is often not the preaching. That's often where you get the chance to say, given what you feel, this is the thing to do. This is where you could come, we'll talk more. But the bit that often reaches the parts that other beers don't reach is worshipful, doxological, joyful, sacramental. Perhaps it's different. It's the things that you just don't get anywhere else. And people do give compelling speeches and arguments for 20, 25, 30 minutes in other walks of life. But what they never do anywhere else is the sort of corporate worship life. So I don't want to downplay preaching, and I know none of the three of us would want to do that, do it all the time. But I think you're right. Sometimes the greatest appeal you can make to somebody is to show someone Christian worship and then say, so what do you think? Or what did you feel? Or,
yes. And they don't have to have gotten it either for that to be...
No, often they don't. And you say to them,
like,
they're in tears and say, what was that? And they're just like, I don't know. It's numinous. It seems to touch different parts of the soul. And that doesn't, again, I'm not trying to be sort of mystical to the extent that you bypass the brain, but I think sometimes then the preaching or the evangelism or the evangelism course, Christianity Explored, Alpha, whatever it is an opportunity to talk about what people experience rather than simply rationalize the faith as if it is just a set of ideas to be transferred from one to another.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that the deeper that you go into Christian community, the more powerful that is, because if I had to pinpoint what is the thing about Sunday morning that most gets me, it's looking around the church at people whose lives I know and whose struggles I know and whose stories I know, watching them worship is so powerful, because I'm like, I know where you've come from. I know where you were even like a few years ago. I sat with you and you were crying last week. Like, just to have that sense, so that the vertical and the horizontal dimension are all just like smushed up together in a way that they're only going to get more smushed up in the new creation, right? As we together are Jesus's bride. Seeing that beautiful expression of God with us in the faces of my brothers and sisters, in worship together, is perhaps my favorite thing about church. Just seeing that, and then I remember when COVID hit, reflecting like, oh, all the things I'm used to at church I can't do anymore, and it's the singing is a huge loss. But it's also, I was like, I probably hugged like 25 people on a Sunday morning, one way, and like. I'm holding people's babies, or I'm like, just the cutting out the touch was like, oh, what is this? It was horrible. I hated it. And getting that back now to be like, oh, this is who we are together, is just delightful.
This will be my last comment on the entire series, I think, but I just think there is something very powerful. That call out to the new creation you gave, Rebecca, I think is saying that for all, and we've talked a lot about, I don't know how many times we've used the word post-Christianity in this conversation, but I do think that ultimately we live in a pre-Christian age.
Yeah.
That we live in an age where all the kingdoms of the world are one day going to become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and that actually the optimism doesn't come from looking at the landscape today and going, these are all the things we could do to fix it. Although I think, as we've said today, there's a lot more hope and a lot more reasons to be positive about that than perhaps many in the church would appreciate. But I think it's coming out of our sense of eschatology, and a sense that actually the direction of history is such that ultimately far more of the world will be Christian than it is now. In fact, the whole world will be Christian as opposed to what is now. And I think that anticipation both of the worshipping life of the gathered church on the last day, but also the sense of evangelistic mission accomplished, that actually there's none of the struggles and tensions, and how do you navigate that and triangulate this need with that question and this sexual ethical issue and that political dilemma. None of that will be needed, and I just think that's the most hopeful thought in the world.
Wonderful. So I guess that's a good place to draw post-Christianity to an end, and that will be this series of post-Christianity. If we do another series, we could call it pre-Christianity, couldn't we? And maybe that's coming soon. Pre-Christianity.
Yeah, because we really are. We're pre-Christendom, not post-Christendom.
Exactly,
really,
we're pre-Christendom. Yeah, and he shall reign forever and ever.
Amen.
Rebecca McLaughlin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
Glen
you
Scrivener,
so much, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you again, and please do give this a rating and review on your podcatcher of choice, and share it on social media. I know I'll be sharing the wisdom of Rebecca far and wide. Why don't you do the same on Twitter and Facebook and wherever else you share these things. Thanks so much, and hopefully see you again.